This is the Shark El Night Airport. It's located in the middle of the desert in Egypt, and it took an impressive 3 months to build. But that's not what makes this airport interesting. Instead, it's what surrounds it. You see, surrounding this airport, you find countless patches of farmland, shaped like circles. Now, the reason why this farmland is shaped like circles is pretty simple. There is a sprinkler placed straight in the middle that is able to cover a circular area. And while this gives a very unique look from a top-down view, it serves a very specific purpose that I'll get more into later. But these circles actually perfectly demonstrate a growing problem Egypt as well as other countries in the region have been facing in recent years, which is a problem that originates from the lack of freshwater resources, as this region has just 1% of the world's total freshwater resources. And if you take into consideration that the Middle East and Egypt have a combined population size of around 350 million, which is around 4.5% of the world's total population, you can begin to understand the problem they are facing. Because it's not just humans who need water, it's also the food we eat that consists of livestock and crops. So what do you do when 350 million people need food and water that you simply don't have? Well, the obvious answer is to just import it from a country that has excess food and water to sell, and who is willing to sell it to you. Now, plenty of countries would be willing to export food as well as water to countries like Egypt and the rest of the Middle East. But the problem with this solution is that they would become too reliant on these food and water exporting countries to survive, which is exactly what has been happening over the past few decades. But this is quickly becoming a geopolitical nightmare for these nations, and Egypt, as well as the other countries in the region, are aware of this issue. Which brings us back to the circles surrounding the Shark El Night Airport in Egypt. This was an attempt to create farmland that could provide Egypt and its citizens with domestically farmed produce. And while this is a great idea, there's still something that doesn't make sense. Because why did they choose this area in particular to put the airport and farmland on, considering it's practically placed in the middle of nowhere in the Sahara Desert? But interestingly, this is the point. You see, Egypt has the Nile, which is the longest river in the world, and it has played an essential part in the Egyptian survival for millennia. But in recent years, the Nile has become increasingly polluted, making 40% of the water and more than half of the fish in the Nile unsuitable for human consumption. This means that almost half of the Egyptian population drinks water that is polluted. But that might not be so surprising, considering that up until 2015, a person, factory, industrial or agriculture institution that throws waste into the river was fined no more than 200 Egyptian pounds, which is around $12.50. Since then, the Egyptian authorities have stiffened fines and cracked down on some offenders. But these efforts haven't been enough. And if this continues, the Nile will end up becoming completely useless, as the water and fish in it will become entirely unsuitable for human consumption. And if Egypt's most valuable asset becomes useless, the country will have a very high likelihood of going extinct due to desertification. Which brings us back to the circles surrounding the Shark El Night Airport. These circles are strategically placed as they are an essential part of the New Valley project that consists of building a system of canals that will carry water from Lake Nasser to the sandy wastes of the western desert of Egypt. This is a desperate attempt from the government of Egypt to spread water across the country to make more of the Egyptian land usable. But this means building an extensive canal that will start in Toshka Bay on Lake Nasser and continue westwards until it reaches the Dar el Alamein route, then northwards along the Dar el Alamein to the Shark El Night Airport, covering a distance of 310 kilometers. But this was supposed to be completed in 2020, and recent satellite imagery reveals something interesting. The canal seems to have been completed, but there's no water running through it, which means the circular farmland surrounding this airport shouldn't exist. So how is this possible? Well, there's only one logical answer. Egypt has begun extracting fossil water. Now, just like any other resource with the word fossil in it, if you use the fossil resource you extract at a faster rate than it can get replenished, you will run out of that resource eventually. Essentially, it's a great solution in the short term, But if you become too reliant on this resource, it will have devastating effects in the long term. But there is one more essential problem with this. As the land is irrigated, the salt from the desert will eventually end up mixing with the fossil water, which would reduce or completely prohibit the usage of this water. This means that Egypt will either drain all the fossil water they have or completely destroy it if they keep going. However, there is still one more problem with the soil of the Sahara Desert, and that is the added technical problems that clay minerals in the soil are posing to big-wheeled autonomous machinery that would normally be used to irrigate the land. Their wheels would simply get stuck in a little bowl created by wet clay that then dries out, which brings the irrigation machines to a complete standstill, making them useless. This means extensive downtimes and, in the worst case, a failed harvest. This is why Egypt found another way, and that is what led to the circular farmland we find surrounding the Shark El-Overnight Airport. You see, one sprinkler can cover the entire area of a circle without the need for any machinery. This is called center pivot irrigation, and it also has the added benefit of not wasting too much water in comparison to traditional farming methods. Countries like Libya, Jordan, Israel, Qatar, and Syria have also used this method because they face similar problems. But as I mentioned earlier, the fossil water they are extracting will eventually run out if extraction exceeds natural replenishment, which it most certainly does, considering Egypt is facing an annual water deficit of around 7 billion cubic meters, and the United Nations warns that Egypt could run out of water as soon as 2025. Right now, Egypt is consuming 20% more water than it has, and with its loosening grip on the Nile, water scarcity could endanger the country's stability and regional dominance. It is vital for the Egyptian government and the entire population of Egypt to act swiftly to mitigate water scarcity, implement water conservation techniques, and control water pollution, as well as develop plans that would install more efficient irrigation techniques. With climate conditions expected to get drier and heat waves expected to become more frequent in the region, Egypt simply can't afford to neglect the importance of water conservation anymore, and must act immediately to augment its natural water reserves. But what options does Egypt have left? Well, considering they have direct access to the ocean, constructing water desalination plants is a viable option. And since Egypt plans to construct 47 new desalination plants by the year 2025, I think they agree. However, these plants do come with some considerable downsides, as most forms of desalination are energy intensive. Furthermore, desalination has the potential to increase fossil fuel dependence, increase greenhouse gas emissions, and worsen climate change if renewable energy sources are not used for freshwater production. And considering Egypt is the largest non-OPEC oil producing country, it's unlikely they will care much about sustainability for these plants. But desalination also has a byproduct that has to be taken into account, and that byproduct is a salty brine that is left in the tank once you have extracted the fresh water. And if this brine is thrown into the ocean, or worse, the Nile, it poses a threat to marine life and water quality, as it contains a dangerously high concentration of salts and other minerals, which could significantly alter coastal ecosystems and accumulate in and around disposal areas that could essentially suffocate bottom-dwelling species. But considering the massive push for these desalination plants from the government of Egypt, it seems these concerns will not have an influence on them building them anyway. Although you shouldn't be fooled by the seemingly large number of desalination plants, because they will not be able to save Egypt from this water crisis, at least not alone. You see, I did the math, and when all their desalination plants are complete, they will have an annual combined production rate of around 275 million cubic meters, which accounts for just 4% of the 7 billion cubic meter water deficit they have today. So Egypt's future might not be as certain as it once was. But what is certain is that only a small percentage of those who watch these videos are actually subscribed. So if you ended up liking this video, consider subscribing, it's free and you can always change your mind.